In 1982, the massive iron doors of the Singer Manufacturing Company's factory in Elizabeth, New Jersey, closed for the final time. No ceremony, no celebration, just silence. For more than a century, this place had been unstoppable, a sprawling industrial titan that once symbolized the absolute peak of American manufacturing power. At its height, the Singer complex covered over 113 acres, contained 48 separate buildings, employed thousands of workers, and produced sewing machines at a scale the world had never seen before. This wasn't just a factory, it was a machine that powered an empire. By the early 20th century, Singer wasn't merely selling sewing machines, it had become embedded in American culture itself. By 1913, the company controlled an astonishing 90% of the home sewing machine market in the United States. The brand was so dominant that language itself changed. People stopped saying sewing machine and simply said Singer. Walk into almost any American home in the early 1900s, and you'd find one sitting proudly in the living room. Not hidden away, but displayed like a piece of furniture, a symbol of modern life, progress, and domestic efficiency. Singer didn't just change how clothes were made, it changed how Americans bought things. Long before credit cards or modern financing, Singer pioneered the installment plan, allowing ordinary families to pay over time for expensive goods. That single decision reshaped retail forever. The company survived two world wars, the Great Depression, and every major economic shock thrown at it. In 1908, Singer even built the tallest office building in the world, a towering skyscraper in New York City that stood as a physical declaration of dominance. And then, shockingly fast, it all unraveled. In less than 2 decades, the factories shut down. Thousands of workers lost their livelihoods. The once proud industrial complex in Elizabeth rotted, poisoned by decades of unchecked industrial waste. Today, what remains is a contaminated graveyard, a decaying monument to America's industrial past. The question is unavoidable. How does a company that seemed absolutely unbeatable fall this completely? To understand that collapse, the story has to begin far earlier, with a deeply flawed man whose personal life was chaos, whose ambitions seemed unrealistic, and who had no intention of becoming a manufacturing legend. This is where the Singer story really starts. Isaac Merritt Singer was born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, into grinding poverty. His father was a German Jewish immigrant who worked as a mechanic, while his mother was a Quaker woman, trying to survive in a harsh economic reality. By the time Isaac was 10 years old, his family had already fractured. His parents divorced, his mother walked out, and 2 years later, Isaac himself ran away from home. Unable to tolerate life with his stepmother, he was 12 years old, alone, angry, and driven by dreams that made no practical sense in his circumstances. What Isaac wanted wasn't stability. He didn't want to be a mechanic like his father or a factory worker, grinding away for survival. He wanted the stage. He dreamed of becoming a Shakespearean actor, chasing applause, drama, and recognition. And for nearly 2 decades, he chased that dream relentlessly. He founded his own traveling theater troupe, toured the country, and poured everything he had into acting. But dreams don't pay rent. By the time he reached his 30s, the theater failed. The money was gone, and Singer was buried in debt, supporting multiple families he could barely acknowledge, let alone provide for. Desperation pushed him toward invention. In 1839, he attempted to design a rock drilling machine. It failed completely. No buyers. No breakthrough. Meanwhile, his personal life spiraled further into scandal. He married young, abandoned his wife and children, carried on relationships across multiple cities, and fathered more children than he could count. By the time his mistresses publicly collided in New York City in the early 1860s, the newspapers tore him apart, branding him the scandal-ridden sewing machine king long before the empire even existed. Yet buried inside this chaos was a stubborn, relentless mind. In 1850, at the age of 38, Isaac Singer found himself working as a low-level machine repairman in a grimy Boston workshop. One day, a broken Lero and Blodgett sewing machine was brought in for repair. Most men would have fixed it, collected their pay, and moved on. Singer didn't. He stared at the machine and immediately saw its fatal flaw. Not something that needed adjustment, but something that needed reinvention. That moment, in a dirty workshop, changed everything. Singer decided to rebuild the machine entirely from scratch. For 11 days straight, he barely slept or ate, working with obsessive focus. What emerged was a breakthrough that reshaped manufacturing forever. A straight vertical needle paired with a horizontal work surface, combined with a foot pedal that freed both hands. The result wasn't incremental improvement, it was a revolution. Hand sewing produced roughly 40 stitches per minute. Singer's machine produced 900. With that design, sewing stopped being physical punishment and became controlled, precise, and dramatically faster. In 1851, Singer secured his patent. The failed actor had stumbled into the foundation of an industrial empire, even if he didn't yet understand what he'd unleashed. That breakthrough in the Boston workshop should have been the beginning of a smooth ascent. It wasn't. Isaac Singer had built a revolutionary machine, but invention alone doesn't create an empire. The moment his patent was approved in 1851, the sharks began circling. Other inventors had been working on sewing machines for years, and none of them were willing to quietly step aside. The most dangerous of them was Elias Howe. Howe had patented key elements of a sewing machine design years earlier and had struggled to profit from it. When he saw Singer's machine explode in popularity, he didn't see innovation. He saw stolen money. In 1852, Howe sued Singer for patent infringement, triggering a legal battle that dragged on for 2 exhausting years. The court ultimately sided with Howe. Singer lost. The ruling was brutal. He was ordered to pay $15,000 up front, an enormous sum at the time, plus a royalty of $25 for every machine sold. That kind of fee should have crushed the company before it even began. Instead, it forced the sewing machine industry into an unprecedented decision. In 1856, the major manufacturers came together to form the Albany Agreement, America's first patent pool. Instead of endlessly suing each other into bankruptcy, they agreed to share technology and split royalties. Singer's per-machine fee dropped to $5. The lawsuits stopped. The industry stabilized. What could have been the end became the foundation for massive growth. But even with legal peace, Singer still wasn't the architect of the empire that followed. That role belonged to a man who couldn't have been more different from Isaac Singer. His name was Edward Clark, a lawyer who joined the company in 1854. Where Singer was impulsive, chaotic, and driven by ego, Clark was calculated, disciplined, and ruthlessly strategic. Clark looked at the sewing machine and realized the problem wasn't demand. It was access. At the time, a sewing machine cost more than $100. For most families, that was several months of income. Clark understood something revolutionary. If people could afford the machine, they would buy it. So he introduced the installment plan. $5 down, a few dollars each month. Suddenly, a machine that had been a luxury for the wealthy became attainable for ordinary households. This single decision transformed retail. Singer wasn't just selling a product anymore. It was selling possibility. And Clark didn't stop there. Instead of marketing to men, the presumed heads of household, Singer marketed directly to women, the people who would actually use the machines. Ads were placed in women's magazines. Female demonstrators were hired. Showrooms were designed as welcoming spaces where women could see, touch, and test the machines themselves. Then came the trade-in program. Customers could bring in their old sewing machines as partial payment for a new Singer. On the surface, it looked generous. In reality, it was ruthless. Singer didn't resell those machines. They destroyed them. Every old machine taken off the market eliminated competition from the used market. Demand for new machines stayed high. Growth accelerated. By 1860, less than a decade after that frantic 11-day rebuild in Boston, Singer Manufacturing Company had become the #1 sewing machine maker in the world. The name Singer didn't just represent a product, it represented inevitability. And with that dominance came the next problem: scale. Demand exploded faster than Singer could build machines. Existing facilities were stretched to the limit. Edward Clark knew that if they didn't act, competitors would catch up. The solution was audacious: build the largest single product factory the world had ever seen. In 1871, Singer chose Elizabethport, New Jersey. The location wasn't accidental. The Arthur Kill Waterway connected directly to the Atlantic, allowing finished machines to be shipped globally. Rail lines ran through the site, moving raw materials in and products out. Immigrant labor was abundant, cheap, and desperate for work. And the land itself offered room to build something unprecedented. When the factory opened in 1872, it was unlike anything America had ever seen. Massive brick and iron structures stretched across the landscape like an industrial fortress. The complex was entirely self-sufficient. It had its own foundries, forges, power plants, gas systems, and internal railways. Singer didn't just assemble machines, it made every component on site. Iron was cast, milled, polished, assembled, painted, and packed without ever leaving the complex. This was early mass production before the term existed. Precision tools, specialized workshops, and tightly coordinated workflows allowed Singer to manufacture machines at scale without sacrificing quality. The factory burned through hundreds of tons of coal each week. Steam engines thundered day and night. Elizabethport transformed almost overnight from a quiet waterfront town into an industrial powerhouse. For the next century, that factory would become the physical heart of the Singer empire, a machine that never slept, a monument to American industrial ambition. And it was only just beginning its golden age. By the mid-1880s, the Elizabeth factory was operating at a scale that bordered on the unbelievable. Every single week, 6,000 to 7,000 sewing machines rolled off the assembly lines. Not per month, not per year, per week. Thousands of workers poured through the factory gates every morning, their lives synchronized to the rhythm of steam engines, stamping presses, and grinding steel. By the time World War II arrived, that workforce would swell to 5,000 people, all moving inside what had become a city within a city. What started as a 32-acre site didn't stay that way for long. Singer expanded relentlessly. Land was absorbed. New buildings rose. By the early 20th century, the complex covered 113 acres, contained 48 buildings, and offered more than 2.5 million square feet of manufacturing space. The factory ran like clockwork, with internal rail lines carrying raw iron from the foundry to the machine shops, finished components to the assembly floors, and completed machines to the packing department. Nothing waited. Nothing slowed down. Disaster came in 1890 when a massive fire ripped through part of the complex, sending flames into the sky and threatening to destroy everything Singer had built. But the company didn't hesitate. They rebuilt quickly, stronger than before, and production barely missed a beat. That response alone revealed how powerful the operation had become. By that point, Singer had already manufactured 13 million sewing machines worldwide. 13 million machines shaping homes, industries, and economies across the globe. And Elizabeth was only one piece of a far larger machine. Singer wanted the world. In 1867, the company opened a factory in Glasgow, Scotland, establishing a foothold in Europe. When demand outgrew that facility, Singer replaced it with something even more ambitious: Between 1882 and 1884, the Clydebank factory was constructed, a 1 million square foot industrial monster employing 7,000 workers and producing 13,000 sewing machines every single week. It became the largest sewing machine factory on Earth. More factories followed. In Podolsk, Russia, Singer tapped into the massive Eastern European market. In South Bend, Indiana, an entire facility was dedicated solely to producing the wooden cabinets that housed the machines. Every location served a specific role in a tightly controlled global system. Singer wasn't just manufacturing products, it was engineering dominance. The sales network was just as aggressive. Thousands of Singer showrooms appeared across the world, from New York to London, from South America to Africa. Customers could walk in, watch a demonstration, sign up for an installment plan, and walk out with a machine the same day. By the early 1900s, Singer exported more machines than it sold domestically. America was home, but the world was the market. In 1913, Singer reached a milestone that still defies comprehension. 90% of the American home sewing machine market belonged to them. 90%. They weren't competing. They were defining the category. Owning a Singer became a cultural rite of passage. Machines were passed down through generations, from mothers to daughters, symbols of self-sufficiency and domestic pride. Singer even reshaped skylines. In 1908, the company constructed the Singer Building in New York City, a 47-story skyscraper that stood 612 feet tall, making it the tallest building in the world at the time. It wasn't just an office, it was a declaration, a message carved into steel and stone that Singer had arrived at the top of the industrial world. By the 1920s, the company operated more than 1,700 stores in the United States and over 4,000 internationally. 60,000 salespeople worked the streets, knocked on doors, and sold the idea that a Singer sewing machine wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Even into the 1950s, Singer still controlled roughly 40% of the market, an extraordinary figure for a company that had already dominated for nearly a century. But beneath the polished showrooms and gleaming machines, another reality existed, one that would eventually crack the foundation of the empire itself. Inside the factory walls, life was harsh. Workers labored 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The pay barely covered survival. The factory floor was loud, dangerous, and unforgiving. Metal dust filled the air. Massive machines stamped and sliced without mercy. Accidents were common, fingers lost, hands crushed, bodies burned. There was no real safety net. If you got hurt, you were replaced. Before the 1910s, child labor was routine. Children as young as 10 worked alongside adults, their small hands perfect for reaching into tight spaces between machines. Unions were discouraged, monitored, and crushed whenever possible. Management ruled through control and fear. The message was simple: you are replaceable. And while Singer built communities, it also poisoned them. For over a century, industrial waste poured into the Arthur Kill waterway. Heavy metals, oils, chemical runoff seeped into the soil and water, contaminating the environment for generations. The factory powered prosperity, but it left scars that would never fully heal. This was the golden age of Singer: unmatched production, global dominance. Cultural influence on a scale few companies have ever achieved. But beneath that gold was rot. Pressure was building. Workers knew it. Communities felt it. And the empire, though still massive, was quietly becoming fragile. By the early 20th century, Singer Manufacturing Company stood at the absolute peak of its power. Few corporations in history had ever achieved this level of reach. Factories on multiple continents, tens of thousands of workers, a product embedded in daily life across the globe. But dominance creates a dangerous illusion, the belief that nothing can truly threaten you. That illusion would be tested by war. When World War I erupted in 1914, Singer faced a decision that would permanently alter the company's trajectory: continue producing sewing machines for civilian life, or pivot toward military production. The choice was obvious and immensely profitable. Almost overnight, factories that had perfected the art of domestic machinery were retooled to produce weapons of war. Sewing machines gave way to artillery shells, pistols, and ammunition. Foundries that once cast iron bases for household machines now poured metal for bullets and gun components. The transformation was shockingly fast. It revealed just how adaptable industrial infrastructure could be when money and government contracts were involved. To meet demand, Singer hired aggressively. Thousands of new workers flooded into the factories. For the first time on a large scale, women were no longer confined to polishing and light assembly work. They operated heavy machinery, handled industrial materials, and proved once again that capability had nothing to do with gender. The war years were wildly profitable. Government contracts paid reliably and kept production lines running at full capacity. Singer became an integral part of the military-industrial machine. The company that had once symbolized domestic comfort now supplied the tools of destruction. When the war ended in 1918, Singer flipped the switch back to civilian production. But the world it returned to was no longer the same. Competition had intensified. European manufacturers rebuilt. New players entered the market. Singer still dominated, but cracks were beginning to show. Production rose and fell with economic cycles. The Roaring Twenties brought temporary stability, but the Great Depression that followed crushed consumer demand. Families struggling to survive weren't buying sewing machines. Even an empire can't sell to empty pockets. World War II forced another, far more extreme transformation. In 1942, the U.S. government shut down civilian manufacturing entirely. Singer went all in. Every resource, every worker, every factory served the war effort. The Elizabeth plant retooled completely, producing aircraft components, ammunition, and military hardware around the clock. Employment surged to an astonishing 40,000 workers, the highest in the company's history. The factory never slept, 3 shifts, 7 days a week, a relentless engine of war production. Once again, women filled roles left vacant by men sent overseas. They welded, assembled, inspected, and operated complex machinery with precision. Singer became a symbol of American industrial might. Planes flew with Singer parts. Soldiers fired bullets stamped in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The company that had once changed home life was now helping decide the fate of nations. But war profits come with a hidden cost. When World War II ended in 1945, government contracts evaporated overnight. The workforce was slashed. Tens of thousands lost their jobs. Factories that had been pushed to their limits now struggled to justify their size. Singer had to retool once again, shifting back to sewing machines after years of producing weapons. The transition was slow, expensive, and chaotic. By the late 1940s, Singer was back in the civilian market, producing far fewer machines than before the war. The years spent focused on military manufacturing had allowed competitors to innovate, modernize, and capture market share. Consumer expectations had changed. The world had moved on. And Singer, for the first time in its history, was playing catch-up. The wars had strengthened the company financially, but they had weakened it strategically. Singer had proven it could adapt under pressure, but it had also drifted away from its core identity. The empire still looked strong from the outside, but internally, the foundations were beginning to crack. When World War II ended, Singer Manufacturing Company walked into a post-war economy that looked nothing like the world it had dominated for generations. On the surface, the company was still enormous. The brand was still trusted. The factories were still standing. But the market had quietly turned against them, and Singer didn't see it coming. The core problem was simple and devastating: saturation. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, nearly every American household that wanted a sewing machine already owned one. And because Singer had built those machines to last, heavy iron frames, durable mechanical parts, they didn't wear out quickly. Machines stayed in families for decades. The golden goose had stopped laying eggs. At the same time, foreign competitors began flooding the market. Japanese and German manufacturers introduced machines that were cheaper, lighter, and increasingly innovative. These weren't low-quality knockoffs. They were well-built, reliable, and priced far below Singer's products. For the first time in its history, Singer faced real competition at scale. Singer's response was paralysis. While competitors invested in research and development, experimented with electric features, new stitching patterns, and modern designs, Singer kept producing essentially the same machines it had made for years. The company relied on its name, convinced that brand loyalty alone would protect them. It didn't. Internally, the problems ran deep. Management had grown bloated and bureaucratic. Decision-making slowed to a crawl, tangled in layers of corporate hierarchy. Research and development was underfunded. Innovation became an afterthought. Production costs continued to rise as American labor demanded better wages and working conditions, entirely justified demands, but expensive ones. Meanwhile, the aging factories required constant maintenance just to stay operational. As margins tightened, Singer panicked. Instead of doubling down on what it still did best, sewing machines, the company made a decision that would accelerate its decline: diversification. In the 1960s, Singer began acquiring companies in industries it barely understood: calculators, typewriters, aerospace, defense electronics. On paper, it looked like smart risk management: spread the danger, find new revenue streams. For a brief moment, the numbers seemed impressive. By 1966, Singer reported $1 billion in revenue. By 1969, that number doubled to $2 billion. The company employed nearly 100,000 people worldwide. From the outside, it looked like growth. From the inside, it was chaos. Only about a third of that revenue came from sewing machines, the very product that had built the empire. The rest came from businesses where Singer had no competitive advantage. Management attention, capital, and resources were siphoned away from the sewing machine division and poured into ventures that drained money instead of generating it. The core business was treated like a cash cow, milked to fund unrelated ambitions. Meanwhile, competitors sensed weakness. Companies like Bernina, Brother, Pfaff, and others innovated aggressively. They introduced zigzag stitching, compact designs, computerized controls, and marketed directly to changing consumer preferences. Singer, by contrast, was stuck in boardrooms debating defense contracts. The decline wasn't sudden. It was slow and painful. Market share slipped year after year. Production volumes fell. The factories in Elizabeth and elsewhere ran below capacity. The company that once controlled 90% of the American market was now just another name in a crowded field, and no longer the best one. Cultural shifts made everything worse. The women's liberation movement reshaped society. Fewer women stayed home. Fewer wanted to spend hours sewing clothes when cheap, ready-made fashion was available at department stores. Sewing shifted from necessity to hobby, and even then, it wasn't a popular one among younger generations. Demand collapsed. Singer had built its empire on a world that no longer existed, and instead of adapting early, the company reacted late, distracted, and divided. The foundation that had once seemed unbreakable was now cracking from every direction. By the mid-1970s, the truth could no longer be ignored. Singer Manufacturing Company was in serious trouble. The diversification strategy that was supposed to save the company was draining it instead. Resources were spread thin across industries Singer didn't understand, while the sewing machine division, still the most profitable part of the business, was neglected and starved of innovation. In 1975, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in more than a century, Singer posted a significant financial loss, not a small dip, a real loss. Wall Street panicked, investors fled, the stock price collapsed, confidence in the once untouchable industrial giant evaporated almost overnight. Management finally reacted, but it was too late and too brutal. Factories across the United States and around the world began shutting down. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off. Plants that had operated for decades went silent. The empire wasn't shrinking, it was bleeding out. The Elizabeth factory, the crown jewel of Singer's industrial dominance, suffered the most. By the late 1970s, production had collapsed. The complex that once employed 5,000 workers and produced thousands of machines every week was a shadow of itself. Singer attempted to pivot toward industrial sewing machines used in garment factories, but even that market was slipping away to cheaper Asian manufacturers. The workforce shrank below 1,000. Entire buildings stood empty, machinery rusted, windows shattered. Walking through the factory during its final years felt less like touring a workplace and more like walking through a mausoleum. The echoes of steam engines, metal presses, and generations of labor lingered in the silence. In February of 1982, the announcement came. Singer was permanently closing the Elizabeth factory after 110 years of continuous operation. The heart of the empire was being ripped out. For the workers who remained, many of whom had spent their entire lives inside those walls, the news was devastating. This wasn't just the loss of a job. It was the end of a legacy. On December 1st, 1982, the factory doors closed for the final time. Thousands lost their jobs, not only at the plant, but throughout the entire ecosystem that had grown around it. Suppliers, trucking companies, restaurants, bars, small shops, all collapsed alongside the factory. Elizabethport, the town that Singer had built, was gutted. Unemployment surged. Property values crashed. Families who had relied on stable factory paychecks for generations suddenly had nothing. Crime increased. Drug use spread. The social fabric unraveled rapidly, and Singer did not stay to help. There were no major severance programs, no retraining initiatives, no serious effort to support the community that had carried the company for more than a century. The company walked away, but the collapse didn't stop there. In 1986, Singer made a decision that revealed just how far it had drifted from its origins. The sewing machine division was spun off entirely. The parent corporation, still using the Singer name, abandoned the very product that had built the empire and focused fully on aerospace and defense electronics. The sewing machine business was sold, traded, and passed between corporate owners like a burden nobody wanted. Each new owner squeezed out whatever value remained. By 1999, the inevitable happened. The Singer Sewing Machine Company filed for bankruptcy. 148 years after Isaac Singer patented his first machine, the business collapsed completely. When Singer shut down the Elizabeth factory in 1982, they didn't just leave behind empty buildings. They left behind a disaster that had been quietly accumulating for more than a century. From 1872 to 1982, the factory had operated in an era where environmental regulations were either non-existent or ignored. For most of that time, industrial pollution wasn't considered a problem. It was simply the cost of progress. For decades, Singer dumped industrial waste directly into the Arthur Kill Waterway and Newark Bay. Heavy metals from the foundry, oils and lubricants from machine shops, chemical solvents from painting operations. All of it flowed into the water, poisoning ecosystems and contaminating sediment for generations. The damage wasn't cosmetic, it was permanent. The pollution didn't stop at the shoreline. The soil across the factory site became saturated with lead, petroleum byproducts, and toxic industrial chemicals. Groundwater beneath the complex turned into a poisonous cocktail that couldn't be used for drinking or development. Before any meaningful redevelopment could occur, massive and costly cleanup efforts were required. Even decades later, parts of the site remain hazardous. After the closure, the factory complex sat abandoned like a corpse no one wanted to claim. Portions of the property were eventually leased to small industrial tenants, machine shops, warehouses, and light manufacturing operations that needed cheap space and were willing to work inside a decaying relic. Most of the complex, however, continued to rot. Roofs collapsed, windows shattered, steel beams rusted through, graffiti spread across walls that once echoed with the sound of industry. Homeless people and urban explorers wandered through the ruins, navigating unstable floors and dark corridors. Some sections became so dangerous that the city was forced to demolish them to prevent collapse. In January of 2024, the old factory made headlines again, not for nostalgia, but for catastrophe. A massive fire tore through part of the remaining complex. More than 100 firefighters battled flames as roofs collapsed and brick walls crashed down. It was chaos, made worse by the age and instability of the structures. Large sections were reduced to charred wreckage, though miraculously, some of the oldest and most historically significant portions survived. Elizabethport paid the highest price. When Singer left, the town lost its economic backbone. Skilled machinists, metalworkers, and assemblers were thrown into an economy that no longer needed their skills. Many left. Others stayed and struggled. Businesses closed. Main streets emptied. Property values plummeted. Crime and drug use rose as opportunity vanished. The factory hadn't just employed the town, it had defined it. And when it disappeared, it took the town's identity with it. Singer extracted more than a century of labor, profit, and growth from Elizabethport, then walked away without looking back. What remained was contamination, decay, and a community forced to rebuild from nothing. This was the true cost of the empire, not just bankruptcy filings and factory closures, but poisoned land, broken livelihoods, and a legacy of abandonment. Isaac Merritt Singer started as a failed actor with no money, no stability, and no clear future. By sheer obsession and timing, he helped ignite one of the greatest industrial empires America ever produced, a company that controlled 90% of a national market, a brand that became a word, a factory that built a town, fed generations, and powered the rise of modern consumer culture. And yet, none of that saved it. Singer didn't fall because it lacked resources. It didn't fall because it lacked history. It didn't fall because it lacked talent or scale or reach. It fell because it believed those things made it untouchable. Because success convinced it that change was optional. Because dominance created arrogance, and arrogance blinded leadership to reality. While the world shifted, Singer stood still. While competitors experimented, Singer repeated itself. While society evolved, Singer clung to a version of the world that no longer existed. And when fear finally set in, the company didn't return to its roots. It ran from them, diversifying into industries it didn't understand, abandoning the product that built the empire, treating workers, factories, and communities as expendable once they stopped generating maximum profit. The result wasn't just corporate failure, it was cultural erasure. Towns hollowed out, families displaced, land poisoned. A century of industrial power reduced to rusting steel and contaminated soil. The machines survived in living rooms long after the factories closed, but the people who built them were left behind without a plan, without support, without recognition. Today, the Singer name still exists, printed on boxes, sold online, manufactured thousands of miles away, efficient, clean, detached. But the Singer that mattered, the one that shaped American life, that built cities and defined an era. That Singer is gone. And that's the real warning hidden inside these ruins. No company is too big to fail. No brand is too iconic to collapse. History does not protect you. Legacy does not forgive neglect. If you stop listening, stop adapting, and stop caring about the people who carry your success, the fall is only a matter of time. Empires don't die in explosions. They decay quietly. One ignored signal, one delayed decision, one assumption that tomorrow will look like yesterday. Singer believed it would last forever. The ruins prove otherwise.